Chapter 18. Home. Soon we had left the village behind us and were in an open country. There was no one else in sight, just the two of us, my father and I, tired but happy, striding out along the curvy country road in the light of the moon. "I can't believe it," my father kept saying. "I simply cannot believe we pulled it off." "My heart is still thumping," I said. So is mine. But oh, Danny," he cried, laying a hand on my shoulder, "didn't we have a glorious time?" We were walking right in the middle of the road as though it were a private driveway running through our country estate, and we were the lord of all we surveyed. "Do you realize, Danny," my father said, "that on this very night, on this Friday, the 30th of September, you and I have actually bagged 120 prime pheasants from Mr. Victor Hazel's wood?" I looked at my father. His face was alight with happiness, and his arms were waving all over the place as he went prancing around along the middle of the road with his funny iron foot going clink, clink, clink. "Roasted pheasant," he cried out, addressing the moon and the entire countryside. "The finest and most succulent dish on earth. I don't suppose you've ever even eaten roasted pheasant, have you, Danny?" "Never," I said. "You wait," he cried. "You just wait till you taste it. It has an unbelievable flavor. It's sheer magic." "Does it have to be roasted, Dad?" "Of course it has to be roasted. You don't ever boil a young bird." "Why do you ask that?" "I was wondering how you would do the roasting," I said. "Don't you have to have an oven or something?" "Of course," he said. "But we don't have an oven, Dad. All we've got is a paraffin burner." "I know," he said. "And that is why I have decided to buy an oven." "Buy one?" I cried. "Yes, Danny," he said. "With such a great and glorious stock of pheasants on our hand, it is important that we have the proper equipment. Therefore, we shall go back into the village tomorrow morning, and we shall buy an electric oven. We can get one at Wheeler's, and we'll put it in the workshop. We've got plenty of electric plugs in the workshop." "Won't it be very expensive?" "No expense is too great for roasted pheasant," my father announced superbly. "And don't forget, Danny, before we put the birds in the oven, we have to lay strips of fat bacon across the breast to keep it nice and juicy. And bread sauce, too. We shall have to make bread sauce. You must never have roasted pheasant without lashings of bread sauce. There are 3 things you must always have with roasted pheasant: bread sauce, chipped potatoes, and boiled parsnips." There was half a minute's silence as we both allowed ourselves the pleasure of dreaming about this beautiful food. "And I'll tell you what else we've got to get," my father said. "We've got to get one of those deep freezers where you can store things for months and months and they never go rotten." "Dad," I said, "no." "But don't you realize, Danny, that even after we've given birds away to all our friends, to Charlie Kinch and the Reverend Clipstone and Doc Spencer and Enoch Samways and all the rest of them, there'll still be about 50 left for us? That is why we are going to need a deep freezer." "But it'll cost the earth." "And worth every penny of it," he cried. "Just imagine, Danny, my boy, any time we fancy a nice roasted pheasant for our supper, all we've got to do is open the lid of the freezer and help ourselves. Kings and queens don't live any better than that." A barn owl flew across the road in front of us, its great white wings waving slowly in the moonlight. "Did your mom have an oven in the kitchen, Dad?" I asked, "when you were a boy?" "She had something better than an oven," he said. "It was called a cooker. It was a great big long black thing, and we used to stoke it up with coal and keep it going for 24 hours a day. It never went out, and if we didn't have any coal, we used bits of wood." Could you roast pheasants in it?" "You could roast almost anything in it, Danny. It was a lovely thing, that old cooker. It used to keep the whole house warm in the winter." But you never had a cooker of your own, did you, Dad? You and Mom, when you got married? Or an oven?" "No," he said. "We couldn't afford things like that." "Then how did you roast your pheasants?" "Ah," he said. "That was a quick trick. We used to build a fire outside the caravan and roast them on a spit, the way the gypsies do. What's a spit? I asked. It's just a long metal spike, and you stick it through the pheasant and put it over the fire and keep turning it round. What you do is you push two forked sticks into the ground, one on each side of the fire, and you rest the spit on the forks. Did it roast them well? Fairly well, he said, but an oven would do it better. Listen, Danny, Mr. Wheeler has all sorts of marvelous ovens in his shop now. He's got one in there with so many dials and knobs on it, it looks like a cockpit of an airplane. Is that the one you want to buy, Dad? I don't know, he said. We'll decide tomorrow. We kept walking, and soon we saw the filling station glimmering in the moonlight ahead of us. Will Mr. Rabbit be waiting for us, do you think, Dad? I asked. If he is, you won't see him, Danny. They always hide and watch you from behind a hedge of a tree, and they only come out if you're carrying a sack over your shoulder, or if your pocket is bulging with something suspicious. We are carrying nothing at all, so don't worry about it. Whether or not Mr. Rabbit was watching us as we entered the filling station and headed for the caravan, I don't know. We saw no sign of him. Inside the caravan, my father lit the paraffin lamp, and I lit the burner, and we put the kettle on to make a cup of cocoa each. That, my father said, as we sat sipping our hot cocoa a few minutes later, was the greatest time I've ever had in my whole life. Chapter 19, Rockabye Baby. At 8:30 the next morning, my father went into the workshop and dialed Doc Spencer's number on the telephone. Now listen, Doctor, he said. If you could be here at the filling station about a half an hour, I think I might have a little surprise present for you. The doctor said something in reply, and my father replaced the receiver. At 9 o'clock, Doc Spencer arrived in his car. My father went over to him, and the two of them held a whispered conversation beside the pumps. Suddenly, the tiny doctor clapped his hands together and sprang up high in the air, hooting with laughter. You don't mean it, he cried. It's not possible. He then rushed over to me and grasped my hand in his. I do congratulate you, my dear boy, he cried, pumping my hand up and down so fiercely it nearly came off. What a triumph! What a miracle! What a victory! Now, why on earth didn't I think of that method myself? You are a genius, sir. Hail to thee, dear Danny. You're the champion of the world. Here she comes, my father called out, pointing down the road. Here she comes, Doctor. Here who comes? The doctor said. Mrs. Clipstone. He spoke the name proudly as though he were a commander referring to the bravest officer. The three of us stood together beside the pumps, looking down the road. Can't you see her? My father asked. Far away in the distance, I could just make out a small figure advancing towards us. What's she pushing, Dad? My father gave me a sly look. There's only one way of delivering pheasants safely, he said, and that's under a baby. Isn't that right, Doctor? Under a baby? Dr. Spencer said. Of course, in a pram with the baby on top. Fantastic, the doctor said. My old dad thought that one up many years ago, my father said, and it's never been known to fail yet. It's brilliant, Doc Spencer said. Only a brilliant mind could think of a thing like that. He was a brilliant man, my father said. Can you see her now, Doctor? And that'll be young Christopher Clipstone sitting up in the pram. He's 1.5, a lovely child. I birthed him, Doc Spencer said. He weighed 8 pounds, 3 ounces. I could just make out the small dot of a baby sitting high up in the pram, which had its hood folded down. There's more than 100 pheasants under that little nipper, my father said happily. Just imagine it. You can't put 100 pheasants in a child's perambulator, Doc Spencer said. Don't be ridiculous. You can if it's been specially made for the job, my father said. This one is built extra long and extra wide, and it's got an extra deep well underneath. Listen, you could push a cow around in there if you wanted to, let alone 100 pheasants and a baby. Did you make it yourself, Dad? I asked. More or less, Danny. You remember when I walked you to school and then went off to buy the raisins? The day before yesterday, I said. Yes, And after that, I went straight on to the vicarage and converted their pram into this special extra-large poacher's model. It's a beauty, really it is. You wait till you see it. And Mrs. Clipstone says it pushes even easier than her ordinary one. She did a practice circuit with it in her backyard as soon as I'd finished it. Fantastic, the doctor said again. Absolutely fantastic. Normally, my father went on, an ordinary bought pram is all you'd ever need. But then, no one ever had over 100 pheasants to deliver before now. Where does the baby sit? The doctor asked. On top, of course, my father said. All you need is a sheet to cover them, and the baby sits on the sheet. A bunch of pheasants makes a nice soft mattress for any child. I don't doubt it, the doctor said. He'll be having a very comfortable ride today, young Christopher, my father said. We stood beside the pumps waiting for Mrs. Clipstone to arrive. It was the 1st of October and one of those warm, windless autumn mornings with a darkening sky and a smell of thunder in the air. What was so marvelous about my father, I thought, was the way he always surprised you. It was impossible to be with him for long without being surprised and astounded by one thing or another. He was like a conjurer bringing up things out of a hat. Right now, it was the pram and the baby. In a few minutes, it would be something else again. I felt sure of that. Right through the village, bold as brass, my father said. Good for her. She seems in an awful hurry, Dad, I said. She's sort of half running. Don't you think she's sort of half running, Dr. Spencer? I imagine she's a bit anxious to unload her cargo, the doctor said. My father squinted down the road at the approaching figure. She does appear to be going a bit quick, doesn't she? He said carefully. She's going very quick, I said. There was a pause. My father was beginning to stare hard at the lady in the distance. Perhaps she doesn't want to be caught in the rain, he said. I'll bet that's exactly what it is. She thinks it's going to rain and she doesn't want the baby to get wet. She could put the hood up, I said. He didn't answer this. She's running, Doc Spencer cried. Look! It was true. Mrs. Clipstone had suddenly broken into a full sprint. My father stood very still, staring at her, and in the silence followed, I fancied I could hear a baby screaming. What's up, Dad? He didn't reply. There's something wrong with that baby, Dr. Spencer said. Listen. At this point, Mrs. Clipstone was about 200 yards away from us, but closing fast. Can you hear him now, Dad? Yes, I can hear him. He's yelling his head off, Dr. Spencer said. The small, shrill voice in the distance was growing louder every second. Frantic, piercing, non-stop. He's having a fit, my father said. It's a good thing we've got a doctor handy. Doc Spencer didn't say anything. That's why she's running, Doctor, my father said. He's having a fit, and she wants to get him in here quick and put him under a cold tap. Some noise, I said. If it isn't a fit, my father said, you can bet your life it's something like it. I doubt it's a fit, the doctor said. My father shifted his feet uneasily on the gravel of the driveway. There's 1,001 different things keep happening every day to little babies like that, he said. That's right, isn't it, Doctor? Of course, Doc Spencer said. Every day. I knew a baby once who caught his fingers in the spokes of a pram wheel, my father said. It cut them clean off. The doctor smiled. Whatever it is, my father said, I wish to heavens she'd stop running. It'll give the game away. A long lorry loaded with bricks came up behind the pram, and the driver slowed down and poked his head out of the window to stare. Mrs. Clipstone ignored him and flew on. She was so close now I could see her big red face with the mouth wide open, panting for breath. I noticed she was wearing white gloves on her hands, very prim and dainty, and there was a funny little white hat to match the perch right on top of her head, like a mushroom. Suddenly, out of the pram, straight up into the air, flew an enormous pheasant. My father let out a cry of horror. The fool in the lorry began roaring with laughter. The pheasant flapped around drunkenly for a few seconds, then lost height and landed on the grass by the side of the road. Crikey, Doc Spencer said. Look at that. A grocer's van came up behind the lorry and began hooting to get by. Mrs. Clipstone kept on running. Then whoosh! A second pheasant flew up out of the pram. Then a third and a fourth. Great Scott, Doc Spencer said. I know what's happened. It's the sleeping pills. They're wearing off. My father didn't say a word. Mrs. Clipstone covered the last 50 yards with a tremendous pace. She came swinging into the filling station with birds flying out of the pram in all directions. "What on earth is happening?" she shrieked. She pulled up sharp against the first pump and seized the screaming infant in her arms and dragged him clear. With the weight of the child suddenly lifted away, a great cloud of pheasants rose up out of that gigantic pram. There must have been well over 100 of them, and the whole sky above us was filled with huge brown birds clapping their wings. "A sleeping pill doesn't last forever," Doc Spencer said, shaking his head sadly. "It always wears off by the next morning." The pheasants were too dopey to fly far. In a few seconds, down they came again and settled themselves like a swarm of locusts all over the filling station. The place was covered with them. They sat wing to wing along the roof of the workshop, and about a dozen were clinging to the sill of the office windows. Some had flown down onto the rack that held the bottles of lubricating oil, and others were sliding about on the bonnet of Doc Spencer's car. One cockbird with a fine tail was perched superbly on top of a petrol pump, and quite a number of those that were too drunk to do anything else simply squatted in the driveway at our feet, fluffing their feathers and blinking their small eyes. My father stayed remarkably calm, but not poor Miss Clipstone. "They nearly pecked him to pieces," she was crying, clasping the screaming baby to her bosom. "Take him into the caravan, Mrs. Clipstone," my father said. "All these birds are making him nervous. And Danny, push that pram into the workshop, quick." Mrs. Clipstone disappeared into our caravan with the baby. I pushed the pram into the workshop. Across the road, a line of cars had already started forming behind the brick lorry and the grocery van. People were opening their doors and getting out and beginning to cross over to stare at the pheasants. "Watch out, Dad," I said. Look who's here."